or poor poor data quality or poor data hygiene. They need to be able to have the right curated and the right structured information. And in many cases, that also includes breaking that content up into components that can answer specific questions. So there's a lot of processes behind the scene. There's a lot of content operations behind the scene, knowledge management practices behind the scene, governance, metrics, many pieces that go into getting value, and that is that there's many invisible layers, and they become visible when companies run into problems and cannot go beyond the pilot. A pilot works great for 10 or 100 documents, but when you get into 10,000 or 100,000, it doesn't work the same way. And you have to think of different mechanisms, different curation, different workflow processes, content operations, information architecture, knowledge architecture, data architecture, and then using the right LLM for the right purpose. So I could keep going, but I'll stop there. And those are just a couple of the elements. Hmm.
Yeah, so perfect, Seth. So I think we have experienced something very similar when we work with enterprises. So I think it comes down to two layers. One layer is the enterprises being prepared in terms of the change management that is required to onboard AI, right? Which in today's world, a lot of companies are trying to experiment with AI, not knowing what entails, what are the requirements to successfully implement AI and not just use AI, right? So
Hmm.
from that angle, we have seen that aligning people, your systems, your processes is extremely important. And secondly, to provide the right context, because without the right context, even the best LLMs are not able to give you the ROI that you're looking for. So,
Mhm.
Seth, if we have to talk from an enterprise productivity standpoint, what do you think is something that usually gets overlooked, something which is beneath the surface, and enterprises
Mhm.
tend to ignore the most and then face the consequences of it?
Sure. So at the start, these always begins with use cases. What are the scenarios? What are the things that people need to do? And use cases can be very simple or they can be very complex, but many organizations are, tackling the very basics. They're tackling, meeting summarization, email summarization, campaign creation, unstructured written communications, you know, uh, 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 action items from conversations, maybe proposal creation. But all of those things are, they're kind of the basics. But what we want to understand is number one, don't overlook those basics because one organization we worked with said they were doing all those things, and then we came up with advanced use cases, and they said, "Well, wait a minute, what about all these basic things?" I said, "Well, wait, I thought you were already doing that." Turned out they really weren't. They weren't doing it across the organization. They had pockets of maturity, but they weren't doing it consistently. And there's got to be some basic foundational training of how to write good prompts, how, as you say, to contextualize your queries and your requests. Many times that's by feeding in supporting documentation. For example, I have LLMs that are trained with my content, with my articles, with my thinking style, my tone, my voice, my approach to problem solving, and they build up this knowledge of how I think, and then can create derivative content from many different sources that I, of course, then edit and vet and approve and refine. But the first thing is understanding what your users want to do, what your users need to do. And there's a lot of low-hanging fruit of just basic productivity that can help people be faster, but people can't over rely on it. What you tend to do is get people who start with AI and they start giving it everything, and then they produce a lot of crap. And they don't, review it. They don't edit it. They just produce. I had someone who was giving me 60, 70-page documents completely generated by AI. I'm like, this is worthless. This is ridiculous. I don't need this. This isn't helpful. Net it out, give me an action item, make it particular to me. They just give me a lot of generic crap by prompting an AI and asking a couple of questions. So you really do need to tell it what your circumstances are, who you are, what your objectives are, what role you want it to play. And that's basic. That's just basic productivity stuff. But then beyond that, we need to start saying, well, how do people need to access this information? And what are the information leverage points in the process? I like to say you can't automate what you don't understand. So the first thing to do is understand what is the end-to-end process that you're trying to enable. And the AI is not going to take over the entire process, but it'll streamline pieces of that process. And that's where you have to look for the things I call information leverage points. Where is it where you need more information, better information, faster information, information you don't already have or you can't have, or whatever, that's going to impact downstream systems disproportionately. So you'll be able to leverage that information in other processes. Your outputs become someone else's inputs, and the faster you can get those to people, the faster they can produce their outputs. And maybe that's go-to-market strategy. Maybe that's new product development. Maybe that's customer acquisition. Maybe it's customer support or service. But what has to happen is understanding and mapping that process and those information flows end to end, and then looking for the gaps, looking for where people don't have the information. That's the specific intervention you're going to have. You're not going to just try to take an AI and have it automate an end-to-end process. That's not necessarily realistic, but you can have specific interventions of where a human needs better, faster, new information, and then decide, well, where does that come from? And what shape do they need that? And that's where the use cases have to be very detailed. If it's a market researcher, they need to understand this particular application in this market, for this industry, for this size organization. We're working with a consulting services group, global company, very well known, and they need to repurpose content from their different practices. So how do you access that? What's the handle? What's your mental model on which you want to find a prior example? It's by industry, it's by project type, it's by technology, it's by size of the engagement, it's by size of the organization, it's by the specific problem they're solving. All of those things need to be hooks into that content, and that is what comprises your knowledge architecture. So use cases directly lead to the handles on which and the labels in which you put onto content and knowledge, and they tell you what good is. They tell you when at the end of the day, what's this system going to do? It's going to do the following things. So we have a library, we'll build a library, 50, 60, 70, 100, 200 use cases for those particular roles and say, this is what it's going to do. And those use cases need to be very granular. They need to be unambiguous. They need to be testable. You need to have an outcome that you can say, yes, that's right or that's wrong. And sometimes because large language models will produce, statistical variable outputs, sometimes you need another large language model to assess that effectiveness and say, are these answers equivalent? Because they won't be verbatims. They'll be conceptually the same, but they may be different outputs, but they can still be valid. So there's a lot of different ways that you need to start testing this. You need to test groundedness, precision, recall, all of these things that tell you whether you're getting the answer you need. And you have to test for hallucinations. You have to test for different types of risks. But the point is that you have this library of use cases which describes your process, describes the job of a human being, describes what they need, and then it becomes the blueprint for success. And then you need to also be instrumenting those baselines. What does the current process take? How do people do it today? If it's proposal creation or RFP response or whatever it is, what's the cycle time like? And that is your baseline. And then when you are have deployed your system and it can achieve those things that you put into your use cases, what's the new measure? And that's how you get ROI, because you take these use cases and say, this is what success looks like. Number one, have we achieved success or not? Number two, has that success impacted the metric, the core process? So those are the things that you need to think about when you're building these.
Absolutely. So that is something which is quite exhaustive, set in terms of what an organization needs to do. And now let's say, for example, an organization has identified a use case and to fetch the information. And I'm asking this, Seth, because you come from a field where you're specialized in knowledge management and the information strategy itself. In an enterprise, the information is probably not in one place, right? It is segregated across. Sometimes not even one team has access to it. So what should an enterprise do to prepare for this, to bring the information together, to feed it into a system in a way they don't even understand clearly? So what would you recommend them to do, and what is the time frame would you recommend them to prepare in advance before they implement AI? Right? I'm sure it varies by use case to use case, but what would be the prep work and the structuring to make sure that the quality of data is in place so that the systems can give the output that they are requiring for the use case?
Yeah. So there's a few different questions in there, and I'll unpack them one by one. The first is fragmentation, data, content, knowledge fragmentation. That is never going away. That is never going away. People say, oh, we want to put everything in one place. That's not going to happen because you have these disconnected, these decentralized processes. And I illustrate this by saying, okay, different parts of the organization are experimenting with retrieval bots, right? Or chat bots or sales assistants or, engineering assistant or support assistant, whatever it is. They're building that on top of their silo of content. But within, say, the sales organization, there's multiple silos of content. There's sales processes, there's customer enablement, there's marketing, there's a lot of other stuff. In engineering, there are multiple sub-processes and silos. So the nature of the beast, the nature of the organization is it's a complex system with lots of different, it's kind of a fractal way of deconstructing the way information flows in the organization. There's always going to be decentralized processes where value is being created in these processes that are disconnected from other processes. It's just the nature of the business, the beast, right? An engineer who's solving a very specific problem doesn't necessarily communicate with sales or marketing or support. So those content repositories are going to have their own mechanisms for access. And what's going to happen is as organizations build more and more of these, you end up with more and more bots and assistants that are disconnected, that are for various silos, and it's going to increase fragmentation of knowledge, not decrease it. What you need instead is something called create once, publish everywhere. And this is where it's a centralized standard for creating content, for componentizing content. One large technology company that we built this for 10 years ago handles 1 million knowledge transactions per day. And their support operations, they use it for field service, they use it for channel marketing, use it for customer self-support, they use it for call centers, they use it for product marketing, they use it for knowledge embedded in the products themselves. And this is something they did before LLMs. We built chatbots before LLMs using knowledge engineering. Knowledge engineering is still required. LLMs are giving you icing on the cake because they can interpret and make things more conversational. So they take a lot of work out of the process, but you still need that content. Now, this company has spent is saving, they tell me they save hundreds of millions of dollars on this process, but it probably took them tens of millions to make this work throughout the entire organization. But we built an architecture for them over 10 years ago, and they have taken it to the nth degree. Now, that's saying, okay, I don't have tens of millions of dollars in 10 years to do this. What do I do now? Well, the first thing you need to do is come up with an enterprise reference architecture, the semantic architecture that tells the organization what's important. What are the important concepts, business concepts, technology concepts, processes, customer concepts, customer types, document types, topics, subjects, all the different organizing principles that go into what's called the domain model, the big bucket organizing principles. And then you build out the various taxonomies and metadata structures that derive from that. And the reason to start at that level is if you start at the data level, you go right into data. I'll give you an example. You do master data projects, you go right to the data field. But that's missing a lot of context because if you take an example like SharePoint, you want to think of a concept first. So imagine you're a consulting firm, methodologies are important to you. You could have a site collection called methodologies, right? You can have all these different methodologies and different sites. You could have a site called methodology. You could have a library within a site called methodology. You could have a list within a library called methodology. You could have a content type called methodology. You could have a metadata within that metadata field within that content type called methodology. You could have a controlled vocabulary value of methodology. So you can go from very large scale processes and organizing principles to very fine grain. If you go right to data, you're going right to the bottom. you're missing out on all that context. So what the first thing you need to do is say what's important to the organization, and then start thinking about how these business concepts start getting built into these different systems. And what you want to do is have consistency of organizing principles. Now, it doesn't mean you have to retag everything and restructure everything. You actually will have to do that if you're looking at very precise information retrieval, say field service or regulated industry or customer support. You will have to refactor your content. You will have to use this reference model. But what happens is every time you stand up a new process, every time you stand up a new technology, every time you stand up a new initiative, you go to that reference architecture and say, what are our core organizing principles? What are the vocabularies? What's the correct terminology? What are the preferred terms? What's the metadata structures that we need to apply? And then apply them appropriately in these different systems. So we have we have multiple, there's no one grand galactic Uber taxonomy. There's multiple taxonomies in an organization. And then when you have the relation, so you have products and you have services, then you have services for a product. That's an ontological relationship. The ontology consists of all the organizing principles, all the taxonomies, and all their relationships between them. And that becomes the knowledge scaffolding of the organization. That becomes part of the reference architecture. When you then take that knowledge scaffolding, you connect it to data, you're building a knowledge graph. And then you have different entry points into that data. So that actually gives the grounding for AI. Knowledge graphs are the source of ground truth for AI because it connects to all the different data sources and lets you surface the data in the right context. So you're not trying to put all the data in one place. You're trying to put a semantic layer on top of that data so that you can identify the right information for that particular process and surface it to the LLM. Now, this also means that there's lots of different ways of structuring that content, of componentizing it, of chunking it, and you have to do that at the right level of granularity for the right purpose. You may be wanting to expose your content publicly for Gen AI search, GEO, generative engine optimization. That's going to take a different metadata structure and different componentization structure than RAG, than retrieval augmented generation. That's going to have a much richer data structure. It's going to have much more detailed tags. It's also going to have a different logical structure and different data structure. So there's many different ways of thinking about this, but at the end of the day, you have to start with a consistent set of organizing principles. You have to build your organizational taxonomies. You have to be able to understand what the data architecture is, and you need to understand the value flows and the data flows and the processes. Like I say, you can't automate what you don't understand. And then once you do understand it, you need to map the data sources and then normalize those data at those sources. And so there's a whole range of things that need to go into that, including metrics and governance and roles and responsibilities. But all of that is required. And by the way, we're building an online course on scaling generative AI. So we're right in the middle of that. We have a 10-part article series coming out. We did this workshop at KM World, 3 hours. I know I'm not supposed to promote anything, but this is just a resource for your readers, for your listeners. But it's going to be how to do this at scale in the enterprise because there's so many moving parts.
Absolutely. So Seth, this is very exhaustive in terms of how it should be implemented under the hood. So now, when it comes to enterprises, not every enterprise would probably have the expertise of understanding what is required as a layer underneath, right? Because they possibly know only the outcome and they don't know the details, and they probably don't have in-house people who can help them understand what's going on or what's required. And there's also another challenge that is happening in the market these days, where people are in a hurry to implement AI, where there is a challenge of balancing speed versus the outcome as well. So for a company which doesn't have the expertise to handle these technicalities that happen invisibly as a layer underneath, what would you recommend? What would you suggest should be the path of action for them to go about? And Seth, before you answer that, I would just like to open the floor to any questions for the audience, because it takes a few minutes for the questions to pop up.
Sure.
So please feel free to answer the questions. And Seth, yeah, over to you. What would you suggest for the end?
Well, it's a good question because it's all about organizational maturity, right? And if you're not very, and we have maturity models and maturity scales and self-assessments and all that sort of stuff. If you understand your current state and your current maturity, then you can calibrate what is realistic for you. Because you can't go to, and we have five-stage maturity models, right? We have them across content and knowledge, AI, and commerce and customer experience and so on. We have about eight different maturity models, and they subsume into an orchestration model and so on. But the point is, if you're at stage one or zero, whatever it is, and you're very haphazard and you don't have defined processes, and your generative AI requires that you have advanced capabilities, that's not going to happen, in 6 months for $50,000, right? You're not going to be able to get there. So you need to be able to calibrate what is achievable at your level of maturity. The other piece of it is to think about what is part of your core competence. What is your differentiator? Because if you do what everybody else does, let's say you just use an LLM generically to do marketing or so on, that's fine. You get efficiency from that, but you don't get competitive advantage. You get competitive advantage from differentiation. Standardization gives you efficiency, differentiation gives you competitive advantage. So then you have to start thinking, what can I do to get competitive advantage? And is that part of my core competency? And if it's your core competency, then you need to build the maturity, you need to build the capability. You can't outsource your core competency. So you may need to do that initially to say, oh, if I'm a high touch organization and I really want to support customers, well, you're not going to build a bot for customers to answer questions. You're going to build a support agent that's going to help your customer service people provide better service, right? So you need to think, where am I differentiating this market? And then what's my core competence? And then what do I need to do based on where I am? And it may be a very simple implementation of a basic knowledge base with an assistant bot, because bots are the new search. They're the new search engine. And again, RAG is search. So you really have to fix search. So I would say getting to the basic, get search to work. Get search to work on core high value content. And the way you identify that high value content is you look at a high value process. What is the most important customer experience or employee experience processes that you have that have problems or bottlenecks with information flow? Tackle that with search, right? Don't try to get fancy. Everybody's going to try to sell you AI search or AI that and machine learning this and machine learning that. Go to the basics. That's information architecture, information curation, content operations. That's foundational. That has to be happening no matter what stage you're at, but especially if you're not mature, that's the foundation. Get your content right, get your process understood, and start curating and managing and tagging that content and get search to work. Base it on use cases. You can test all of that stuff. You can see unambiguously what the outcome is, and then content supports a process. Measure that process, and you'll get better process outcomes with better content and data.
Perfect. So, Seth, this was very detailed in terms of the layers that you have gone underneath what happens beyond the use cases. So, I'm sure that the audience had a lot to take away in terms of how they should implement AI and to think beyond just what's happening on the surface, right? So, I'm sure that we will have a lot of questions here for you. So I'm going to pick up a few questions which I find the most relevant, Seth. So one of the questions that we have here is how much of the new AI is still dependent on humans for its implementation? And conventionally, digital transformations have failed primarily due to humans, right? So when AI and humans come together, so how much is the dependency still in place, or is it changing with time?
Well, put it this way. In our course, we have a whole section on stakeholder alignment. And one of the biggest problems in any organization is stakeholder alignment. Let's say you build a pilot, and the pilot people like, and it's successful. And you go, this is great, let's deploy it. And then you run into roadblocks and you have problems. And then the deployment is not performing the way the pilot did. Well, guess what? You turn people off. They don't trust it. They won't use it. You get into a vicious cycle of disuse. And then when there's no use, there's no funding, right? There's no benefit, there's no funding. So you spiral downward. So just like digital transformations, it is a people issue. It is an alignment issue. It is a governance issue. It is a change management issue. Because yes, the technology is a big challenge. The content is a big challenge, but the content is also based on humans, right? Because humans are the source of that content. And they are the subject matter experts who have to be able to tag that content appropriately. Yes, you can use automated tagging. You can use machine assisted indexing. You can do auto classification and all those things, but you still need humans, and you still need humans to review things, and still humans consume and produce content. So it is critical. I mean, very rarely are you having end-to-end automated processes. You can get there. Amazon does that with many returns processes, and many of these digital native companies do have many of those automated processes where there's no human in the loop. But for the most part, for most organizations, it is very, very dependent on buy-in, trust, change management, socialization, and being able to understand and provide a voice for your users. The users have to have their skin in the game. They have to have their fingerprints on these things. You have to engage them and help them understand, number one, to trust it. Number two, that it's not taking their job, right? That you're not just trying to automate their job away. Yes, there will be job impacts because that's just the nature of the beast. We're improving productivity so we can do more with less, or we can do more with more. We can do more with more capabilities. But the point is that your questioner hit the nail on the head. Because without that, these things will not go anywhere.
Absolutely. So another question which goes hand in hand with this, Seth, is that how do organizations with legacy systems approach this? What's a practical way for them to begin building this invisible layer without or having this whole system underneath without disrupting operations?
Yeah. So that is a fundamental question of where to begin and where to prioritize and how to prioritize. You're going to have some disruption no matter what. But what you can do is you can do things in parallel, and you can build a new knowledge base or repository with a clean sheet approach. You're not necessarily, I mean, there is value to going back and looking at legacy content and mining that legacy content. But in many cases, you're curating that content, and you're bringing it into a new environment that you can then operationalize and build, automation on top of. So it starts with the process. It starts with the business objectives, right? Business outcomes, pain points, and processes that are part of those pain points, and what your stakeholders need and what your customers need. So once you start mapping those out, now you can start saying, can we build a curated information source that is going to support this process? And is it valuable enough to do that, right? You're not just going to go out and organize a whole bunch of old content for the sake of organizing, right? If it doesn't have a business purpose. So the first thing you have to do is curate it and say, what is the most critical content and information I need to support this process or support this user? And you find that a lot of stuff that hasn't been touched for 3 years just doesn't have value, right? There may be some evergreen content, and you can identify that, but it's really starting to, triage that and curate it and start to say, okay, what does this process, what do these use cases, what do these customers, what do our employees need? And let's start with a subset so that we can prove this out, and then go back and review our legacy content and start ingesting that using some of the AI powered tools, some of the automation. We happen to have something called the virtual information architect that does a lot of that stuff. It's still a services accelerator, not a standalone product, but it will be. But it can improve that by a factor of 10, by making it 10 times faster to do that stuff. So there are approaches, but again, you have to start with that foundational architecture, that reference architecture that I started talking about before. Then you can do all of these other things.
Okay. So Seth, in the interest of time, I'm just going to take one last question, though we have a lot more questions that have popped up. So with the rise of Gen AI and so many co-pilots in the market, what new risks do you think organizations should be very conscious about at the foundational level while implementing AI?
So one major risk is letting your IP out into the public. We built this pocket technician using proprietary content from an organization, and they had rights to that. They licensed that content from their equipment manufacturer. Well, guess what? Their technicians started asking questions of ChatGPT and found these copyrighted materials on the in public LLMs. Well, guess what? That's not okay. That's competitive advantage. So you need to lock down. You need to not train the models with your content, and that's a very clear setting that you need to proactively set to not share your content and train the model with your content. So you can't let out, or you need to use private LLMs, right? Your own offline versions. So protecting IP is critical. The other is making sure that your users understand that the answers they get from public models will not necessarily be correct. If you are a regulated industry, so for this company, yes, they could get the answer to a manual, but it wasn't necessarily correct. It wasn't curated. It wasn't approved. It wasn't vetted, right? And there's other confusing information out there, and there's other ancillary information. You need to make sure your users use your source of truth, especially if you're regulated, especially if you have, high risk customers, especially if you have high risk processes or you have proprietary content. You can't let that out. You have to safeguard it. And so that's a big piece of this, and making sure you're not having hallucinations. And there's a whole bunch of safeguards to reduce or prevent hallucinations, such as telling the LLM only to answer the question from a particular data source. If it doesn't have the answer from that data source, say, I don't know. So hallucinations, risk of IP loss, there's a whole bunch of others and that get much deeper and more complex, but those are the big ones to think about.
Perfect. All right. So, Seth, this was a really power-packed session where you touched on a lot of technical aspects as well as implementational process, governance, security, as well as the risks that the enterprises need to keep in mind. So I'm sure that the audience had a lot to digest, and there could be follow-up questions. So in case they have,
Yeah.
I would definitely recommend them to reach out to you because you have a lot of expertise coming from the space. Yeah.
And send me those questions, and maybe we can record an addendum, or I can write something up or produce an article, and your folks can access it. But go to www.earley.com, EARLEY. Don't forget the E before the Y. A lot of new content coming, so keep your eyes open for that. And we have a webinar, I think it's on the 17th, on scaling generative AI projects. So go to the website, check that out. Should be right on the homepage. We have a podcast that was listed as one of the top 50 podcasts globally on AI. So tune into that. And again, get on our mailing list. We have lots of great content that we're happy to give away. And then we have some courses coming up. So happy to answer any questions I can.
Perfect, Seth. So it was lovely having you here. Thanks for joining in, and thanks for everyone who tuned into this episode. You have a good day.
Thank you for having me. Bye now.
Thank you. Thanks, Seth.